In problem 3 of chapter 12, the question asks you to consider this country wage land. And it says, in this country wage land, workers sign wage contracts on January 1st, and this year, after the price level falls, and so they sign these wage contracts for an entire year, and then they signed these contracts, and then right after they signed them, the price level fell. And so the question here is how aggregate output will respond to the fall in prices in the short run. That's a really important point that they ask you about the short run specifically. So my first step is I am going to draw my two axes. Okay, so I'm going to basically just set up my my model. And remember that when we are doing aggregate supply and demand, on the y-axis we have the price level, okay, P. And that is typically measured by the GDP deflator. And then over here on the horizontal axis, we have, and I'm just going to extend this out a bit, we have aggregate output. Okay, and we typically measure this using real GDP, and we call this Y. Okay, so my next step is I'm going to draw a short run aggregate supply curve, which looks just like our supply curve for a one good market. And so this is my short run aggregate supply curve, the first one. Okay, and they also tell me, importantly, they say that we should assume that the economy starts at potential output. So that's really important. So that means, I'm going to use a different color, that remember what potential output is. Potential output is the amount of output that is achieved in the long run. So if we draw our long run aggregate supply curve, that's a little crooked, but this is my long run aggregate supply curve, then where this long run aggregate supply curve hits this horizontal axis, this is the level of output that is potential output. And we denote that as Y sub P. So this is potential output. And remember why we say this is potential. We assume that in the long run, our producer has the capability to change his or her production costs. Well, all our suppliers have the ability to change their production costs and arrange their factories in a way so that they are producing exactly what they want to be producing. They're fully using their productive capacity, and they are basically producing at a level that achieves their potential. And that's that level here on the horizontal axis, Y sub P. So when the problem tells you that we start at a level of potential output, what they're saying is that the short run aggregate supply curve, from the short run aggregate supply curve, we are here. Okay, we are at a level where we are exactly producing our potential output. And now the problem asks you to think about how the short run aggregate supply curve will respond to a fall in prices. So we were here, say, for instance, so let's say that we were here at, I'm going to call this P sub 1, our first price level. And then the price level fell, okay? And we can say maybe that it went from here to here, okay? So now our price level fell to this second line down the vertical axis. So remember what happens in the short run. In the short run, we assume that our producer cannot change his or her production costs. Now, I keep saying one producer as if we're talking about one person, but in reality, we're actually talking about all suppliers in the economy because we're talking about aggregate supply. So we assume that in the short run, our suppliers in the economy cannot change their production costs. Importantly, they cannot, for instance, and this is a really good example to illustrate this, our producers cannot go to the workers in wage land and try to change their wage. And that's a production cost. Why can't they change the wage? Well, because they signed a contract with their workers on January 1st that lasts an entire year. So they don't have the flexibility to be able to adjust those wages downward to make up for the fall in price. So they're kind of just stuck with their production costs in the short run. So the only option they really have, because their production costs went up, so their profits going down, the only option they have in the short run is to reduce their supply. So what our suppliers are going to do is they're going to move along the supply curve until they are producing the amount of product that corresponds with how much they want to produce at this lowered price level. So now we're at this second point along the aggregate supply curve. Okay, and that corresponds with a new level of output. So I'm going to call this y sub 2, just because this is our second point. So we were here at y sub p. So we were here, and now we are at y sub 2. Okay, this new level. So in the short run, we can see that our output, our aggregate output measured by real GDP, is going to drop. Okay, now in part B, the problem says, what happens when firms and workers renegotiate their contracts? So what's going to happen when our workers renegotiate their contracts? Well, so hold on a second. Okay, so let's call this what? P sub 2. I forgot to label that. So now we are thinking about the long run. In the long run, we expect that now our suppliers can readjust their workers' wage to make up for the fact that there's been a fall in the price level. Remember, now in the long run, these contracts that our suppliers signed with their workers in wage land have run up, so it's time to negotiate a new contract. And we would expect that our suppliers would take into account the fact that price levels have dropped and will try to adjust their workers' wage downward. So in other words, you're going to reduce the wage so that they can return to a level of output that's their potential output. Now, there has been no change in the price level, so we're not moving along the short-run aggregate supply curve. Instead, what's going to happen is that the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right. Okay, and so we're going to get, and we're going to shift to the right until we get to a point in production where we are producing our potential output again. Okay, so we started here, we went here, and now we're going to end up here, 3. Okay, and this movement to our potential output, our movement to 3 is going to generate a shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve, and that's a terrible aggregate supply curve, but nevertheless. So this is our short-run aggregate supply curve sub 2. It's our second one. So we're really going to end up at a point where we are producing our potential output again. Why are we going to end up there? Well, because now in the long run, our producers can renegotiate the workers' wage so that they have basically eaten the cost of having of the price level dropping. Okay, so that's how we would show that in the diagram.